thrilled this afternoon to welcome Cameron Martin, a visiting artist at Tandem Press, where he's creating prints with our master printers. Cameron Martin was born in Seattle, Washington, and lives in Brooklyn, New York. He studied at NYU and completed his degree at Brown University, where he did a double major in art and semiotics. He has received several awards, including a Samuel T. Arnold Fellowship and a Pollock Krasner Foundation Award. He began to exhibit his work in group exhibitions in 1994 and had his first solo exhibition in 1999. His most recent show, which was held last spring, received critical acclaim in both the New York Times and the New Yorker. The critics said, "A stark, beautiful show of reductive landscape paintings. Cameron Martin strips nature down to the essentials: trees, water, rocks, devoting each canvas to a single subject. Sky has a recurring cameo too, sneaking in as a flat field surrounding a truncated plane tree or a shimmering alongside a rock pile. One by one, the pictures convey both the ache of isolation and the rapture of solitude." We have had the great experience since yesterday afternoon of welcoming Cameron Martin to Tandem, and we've actually seen his work. We are thrilled again to welcome him here tonight, where he will speak about his work. Please join me in welcoming Cameron Martin.
I hope not to invoke too much of the ache of isolation tonight. I want to say thank you to the people at the university and especially the people at Tandem Press for having me. It's been really nice so far. Great people to work with, so thanks a lot. I spent my last year in school in a program in New York City called the Whitney Independent Study Program, which is a program run by the museum where they give young artists a studio and you meet a couple times a week to have lectures and discussion groups. And it's a really theoretically oriented program. And I also studied a lot of theory while I was in school. And while I was there, I was reading a book that was by this guy, Jonathan Crary, that's called Techniques of the Observer, which is sort of about how vision was constructed in the 19th century and how in modernity we started to see visual images in an entirely different way than we had seen them before, especially with the invention of all kinds of optical devices, including the camera. And while I was in school, it was sort of at the end of the time when people were still thinking about ideas around appropriation, and a lot of the theory that we were reading was related to ideas of simulation and a kind of a copy for something that there was no original for. And so, actually maybe we'll have the lights now. So I started collecting all of these advertisement photographs. Just so you know, I didn't actually touch that. It just came on. Anyway, I started collecting all these advertising photographs, and I grew up in Seattle, as Paula said, and I was surrounded through much of my youth by all of this imagery of nature that was used to sell things, basically. Because Seattle is a place that's surrounded by mountains. It's the kind of par excellence Patagonia culture, where everybody there considers themselves to be some sort of outdoors person on some level. So when I moved to New York and I was suddenly in the Whitney program in this studio with no windows, I think I started to think about nature and representations of nature in a kind of different way. And so I started collecting these images out of magazines and things and kept them in my studio. And I was interested in the way that, similar to what I was saying about people who were interested in this idea of simulation and how there was a kind of copy for something there was no original of, in these pictures, I always felt like the experience that the advertisers were trying to convey was one of a nostalgia for something that never necessarily existed. So with something like the the polo ad that we have here, the idea that if you buy these clothes, you suddenly become an explorer, a traveler, or an adventurer, or maybe all three, and then having as a backdrop this kind of non-specific generic landscape space that's never indicated where it is geographically, but at the same time it's something that we're all supposed to have some sort of relationship to. So I'll just show you a few of these pictures. The Jeep ads, of course, once again giving you this idea that you might be able to get somewhere particularly exotic when in fact probably you just drive your SUV to your kid's soccer practice or whatever. This is from a beer ad. And there was always this element of grandeur in the pictures, I thought, and invoking some of the ideas, although not explicitly, but invoking some of the ideas that were popular in early American landscape depiction of the sublime and a kind of experience of nature that was possibly one of beauty, but also one of awe and even in its extremity, terror in a certain way, or something that you couldn't overcome. This one I always thought was really quite confusing. It was like, if you buy our shoes, you can run through hell. I don't really know what that's about. But I like the kind of epic quality of this picture in a way, too. It kind of looks like Lord of the Rings or something. And this one is the quintessential capitalist icon where consumer culture is quite literally mapped directly onto nature. I think Marlboro really deserves an award for the most vulgar ads using landscape imagery in the history of advertising. And there were these more sort of serene scenes. This one is nice too, Kashmir Mist. If anybody can tell me what Kashmir Mist is, I'd be really curious to know. And the reason I'm showing you so many of these is because you'll see that they are source material for paintings that I'll show you later. And of course, lifestyle was also one of the things that was often invoked in these pictures. So there were other artists like Richard Prince, whose photograph, this is one of his photographs, who had dealt with this kind of issue of, in particular, the West being depicted in advertising. And what he did was, as I'm sure many of you know, just reshoot Marlboro ads, crop them, and then present them as his own artwork. And I always felt like this was, while it was an interesting kind of idea on a certain level, was ultimately extremely cynical and was trying to convey this notion that you could no longer have an experience of nature that wasn't already mediated through culture in some way, which I didn't really agree with. I thought that while there was a certain level of mediation, what was interesting about it was how that mediation affected your actual experience, and that it wasn't necessarily totalizing. So at the same time, because of my interest in this book, Techniques of the Observer, I started looking at a lot of 19th century photographs. This is a photograph. The next two photographs are by Carlton Watkins. And one of the things that's addressed in Jonathan Crary's book is the idea of how the camera presents what is put forth as a kind of facsimile of actual space or an environment that we can recognize as being someplace maybe we've even been, when in fact the camera does all these things, like for instance in this sky, there's no sky in the world that would look like this. The depth of field in the camera erases entirely any trace of the clouds or any gradient or anything, and I always thought this was an incredibly interesting sort of phenomena that cropped up in a lot of modernist painting later, where there's this kind of flat ground where there's an image superimposed over the top of it, which is something that I do in my own work, as you'll see in a minute. But I also liked how, this is also by Carlton Watkins, I also liked how 19th century photography conveyed this sense of nostalgia, but was grounded in something that was different than the advertising photographs were so much about the present, or not necessarily even about the present, but about a total lack of specificity as to what they were, time-wise, what they were depicting, whereas the 19th century photographs invoked history with a capital H. So while I was in the Whitney program, the studios there are near Canal Street in New York, which is a street where you can pretty much buy anything industrial. And while I was there, I didn't have a lot of money at that time, and so I wasn't really using traditional art materials. And so I would go to these paint stores and buy different kinds of paint and test them out just to see how they would work for different things I was trying. And one of the paints that I bought was this auto detailing paint that was called interference paint. And interference paint is typically used if you've ever seen like a lowrider car where someone's name will be written on the back of the car, and if the light changes, you see the name sort of flicker. And so it's normally used in this very small amount. But I went to this surplus store and bought this incredible amount of this stuff and started making these layers of it and built it up in this way that's much more opaque than it's typically used. And what that did was allowed for pictures where, depending on how natural or artificial light was hitting the surface of the canvas, it had a very different color effect. And I'll show you some images of how that looks. So this is with extremely indirect light. This is a little bit more. This is even more. You can see this is sort of early stages of this, so you can see a lot of the brush strokes in it and everything. And then if there's direct light, it becomes this very luminous kind of gold. So I liked the way this paint had this effect of, on the one hand, having a very industrial kind of feel when it was kind of steel gray, and then invoking something more luminous and possibly sublime. I liked the way that it had this tint that felt like it referenced 19th century photography in a certain way, and that'll become more explicit in the next image. So I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are artists, as you know. One of the things that's hard about being as an artist is how do you choose what to make art about. And so I had all these ideas, but I didn't necessarily know how to go about or which strategy I was going to use to try to go about making these paintings. And so I decided that I had to set up certain rules for myself to limit the number of options that I have so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. So one thing that I decided was that I was going to paint in black and white, which also allowed for the pictures to have this 19th century photography effect. And I decided that the first images that I would work with would only be mountains. So this is a picture of, there are 5 pictures in this first series of paintings that I did right after I got out of the Whitney program. And this mountain, the image is directly taken from a beer bottle that I found in Germany. And this picture is taken from the Patagonia clothing logo. And I talked before about lack of specificity in terms of location, and one thing that's interesting about Patagonia as a logo is that Patagonia is an actual place on the border of Chile and Argentina, and these are mountains. But in a certain way, maybe it's not non-specific, but by using it for their logo, there's a kind of erasure of the specificity that goes away, I think. This was taken from a Marlboro ad. So in all of these pictures, I'm eliminating the text, obviously, and each of these images is about 5 feet by 6 feet. They're all untitled. And of course, there are also certain formal things that I'm playing with, having this, these deep areas of black, a kind of lack of detail in certain areas, and then much more rendering in other areas. But even that rendering becomes sort of abstract in a certain way if you look too closely at it. This one was taken from a placemat in Eastern Washington. And this was the last picture. So all these paintings are made with oil paint and this interference paint as a kind of background. And so after I did these, I continued to work with mountains for a while. And I should say also that for every painting I'm showing you that is more or less an image that I can stand looking at, there's probably 5 pictures that I made that I can't stand looking at anymore. So it's highly edited. This is another image taken from a Rolex ad. It's much smaller. It's 24 by 20 inches. And this image was probably the most widely exhibited painting, well, probably that I've ever made, but certainly at that time, as I was just starting to show my work. And this is a picture of the mountain that appears at the beginning of the Paramount Pictures films, but all the stars and the logo are taken away and everything, and then it's kind of stripped down and made slightly more bleak, I think, than their Technicolor rendering. And this painting to me was an endpoint to a certain degree, because I felt like it was literally the kind of paramount in this idea. And so it was really the last mountain picture that I made. And also, when this painting was exhibited, I found frequently that when I would talk to people afterwards, they would say to me, well, you know, I had this initial experience of enjoying it as a painting, which of course was what I wanted. And that's why I never titled the paintings after their source material or anything. And they said, and then someone told me, oh, it's the Paramount logo. And I thought, oh, I get it. And I sort of moved on to the next thing. And so I started to consider that, how the kind of conceptual aspect of the work was playing into what I was doing, and how in some ways it was limiting it. And also how really after making this picture, it would just seem like reiteration to me to continue to work with that same strategy. And so I started making these more spare pictures that were possibly readable as sort of seascape images or desert images. And at this point, I kind of opened up what the source material for my paintings could be. Some of them still, to this day, do come from advertising images, but I also take my own pictures. I use stock photography. And I think I got interested in a way which becomes more explicit as you see other paintings, but rather than appropriating these kind of popular culture icons, I think I got interested more in making my own popular culture icons in a way. So these paintings, I think, I'm also, another thing that I think is going on here is that the technique for making these paintings is getting refined as I go. I'm learning as I go, which I hope is still happening, but I think it's particularly obvious at this stage. And I was pushing them in all these different directions where I could see how reductive I could be after having these pictures that were making these mountain pictures that were so monumental and in a certain way intentionally overbearing. I was interested in really pushing things back as far as they could go and taking as much out of the picture as I could, but still having it be a picture. And also working with the horizon line in a more direct way, trying to have a relationship to a sense of depth and conveying space through what is basically a pretty simplistic technique, but a very effective one. And at the time that I was making these paintings, I'm not sure if that slide might be out of focus. It looks like it from here, but I was offered my first one-person show in New York, and I chose to do 5 paintings. They were all between 5 feet by 6 feet and 6 feet by 8 feet, I think was the largest one. So these were the 5 paintings. And my intention with the pictures was that each one was using a distinct pictorial strategy. But because of the material aspect of it being so similar, I don't think anybody actually picked up on that. And so that's something that I'd come back to later. I think people in general saw it as a kind of serial production of pictures of similar places, or maybe even the same place in some people's mind. And what was interesting was that a lot of people came to me and said, oh, I saw your show, and those were pictures of, and whatever they would fill it in with was always where they had vacationed when they were a kid or something. And it could have been anywhere in the world. Some people said they thought it was Cape Cod. Some people said they thought it was in Europe. Some people told me they thought it looked like beaches in Thailand. I wasn't even sure there were beaches, but so that's how people interpreted them. So that side of it was actually satisfying, that people were picking up on this idea of a nostalgia that it was triggering for them, even though the sources came from all over the place. So I'll just show you the 5 paintings. In terms of the different pictorial strategies, this one was supposed to implement this idea of a kind of collage type effect where the rocks in the foreground were superimposed over this basically monochromatic ground that had this slight hint of a horizon line. This one was supposed to be just mark making. This was a photographic reference because of the cropping, because you would never really see something like this unless it was framed by a camera. This one was supposed to be kind of reference to either, or both, kind of semaphore and certain kinds of modernist abstract painting where at first it looks very flat and it looks like these 3 sections, and then as you spend more time with it, it develops this sense of depth. And this painting was an attempt to make the closest thing to a non-objective painting I could make while still having it, because of the context, be an image. So there are a couple other paintings that I made at this same time. These were not in the show. But so the result of that show was that I was thinking about the kind of different responses that people were giving me, and I feel like the great thing about having exhibitions is that they give you this kind of sense of finality in a certain way and allow you to move in a different direction. It doesn't necessarily mean like, okay, right then and there I'm never going to make another picture that looks like a beach or something like that, but eventually, this is a really weird sort of Martian picture or something. I don't know what this is about. But it allows you to have this sense of punctuation in a certain sense. And so I was continuing to make these things, but thinking about what it was that I actually wanted to be conveying with the images. And some of those things were coming through and some of them weren't. And so the next group of pictures that I made, and I think the groups sort of come up retrospectively. I didn't think of them that way anymore. But the next kind of shift that I made, I think, started with this next painting, in that I wanted to get back to having more rendering in the space. I think I sort of went through that period where it was okay to be as reductive as possible and got that out of my system. In this painting, I eliminated the horizon line almost completely, and what I found with that was that it actually conveyed a greater sense of emptiness or depth than the horizon line pictures had in a certain way, because it allowed you to really project your own experience into the kind of blankness of it. And it also tried to exacerbate this idea of the picture being entirely constructed. And so that notion of the collage aspect of the previous painting was heightened in this one with this incredibly sharp, well-defined line and this superimposition. So I started working in this way, doing these various different pictures. And all of these paintings that I'm showing you are still in that same size range, around 5 to 6 feet in different proportions. And as I started getting more and more into the rendering and more confident with the rendering in a certain way, I think I allowed them to get weirder and weirder in terms of what I think of as the internal space of the picture, or the part that is, I guess in these images, sort of not anything that is not the sky, I think of as the internal space of the picture. So they started to take on this kind of abstract effect where your initial, or my hope was that your initial impact was, okay, I can recognize this image. It has this kind of photographic reference to it. It is recognizable in some way. And then as you look at the internal space of the picture, it's really, there isn't really that much detail in a kind of photo representational way or something. It's really, these become places that you probably have not ever been. And even the kind of formal plausibility of the picture becomes a little bit questionable, where you wonder, like in this image, for instance, could those rocks actually be held up by what ultimately looks like this big pile of marshmallow or something? And you can see also that in each of these, I'm really exploiting that idea of the kind of cutout form once again. And that also is borrowed from those Carlton Watkins photographs where the depth of field washed out the sky behind the pictures. So there is a kind of precedent for this, but at the same time, it's not something that you would see in reality per se. So it's obvious to me anyway that as I look at these, that one thing that's happening is I get more and more sort of confident technically with the pictures, and I'm really getting comfortable with the materials in a certain way. The grounds are much more developed, where you're not seeing those kind of streaks as you were before. They're fairly seamless. And the push and pull between the kind of abstract and representational quality is maybe coming through a little bit more effectively. This one was probably my attempt at putting the greatest amount of information possible in the foreground of a picture. So as I started doing these, I started thinking I'd never really wanted to be the kind of artist that was like, oh, Cameron Martin, the guy who paints rocks on a gold background. You know, I think in a way, and I think actually that the art world sort of encourages you to be that kind of person where you have these icons that are recognizable. But I always was an admirer of artists like Ed Ruscha and Sigmar Polke, who just seemed to work however they wanted to work on a given day and made abstract images, made landscape images, you know, whatever came into their head at a certain time. So I didn't totally want to switch gears the way those guys might have, but I wanted to start thinking about different kinds of ways of making pictures and open up my imagery a little bit. And so I'd been walking down the street to my studio in Brooklyn for several years and noticing these trees that were on the way to my studio that had this kind of ready-made abstract painting in the bark pattern. And so I wanted to make, oh, there's one more of these. Maybe there's even more. Oh, sorry. More rocks. There it is. So I wanted to make these pictures that were a little bit different than that. And the first one, this is the first semi-successful one that I made. And I did it using the exact same materials that I had been using before. And it kind of came out okay, but ultimately what I decided was, well, first of all, the orientation of this is a little weird because I had this idea that it was supposed to look like a branch sort of coming into the frame in a certain way, although I think ultimately it just looks like a tree that's turned on its side. But that was my idea when I was making it. So I felt like this was working okay, but it was a little too rendered. It was a little too fussy in a certain way, because what I really liked about these trees, the trees, by the way, are called London plane trees, was that they had this hard edge quality to them. And so I made another version of this same painting using different materials. This is a silver background, and you can see that the kind of fussiness of the shadows in the bottom of it gets taken out a little bit. And that was okay, but then I decided that in fact what I wanted these to be was I started experimenting a lot more, and I wanted them to be much more kind of pop than they were, and still have that quality of kind of bleakness to them that the previous images did, but be a little bit confusing in a certain way too. And so the next ones that I started doing, I did in acrylic paint, which I hadn't really used before. But it allowed for the images to be much more hard-edged, and the shadow part of this is still, the kind of rounding effect is still painted in oil paint, but the majority of it is in acrylic paint. And it allowed them to have this kind of stark quality that the actual trees themselves do, especially by stripping away all of the foliage and everything. And they were this, I mean, in none of the paintings that I have made up to this point, is there anything that is particularly vibrant or alive. The rock pictures or the mountain pictures or anything, there's nothing really that could be conceived of as green space. And there's a similar sensibility that's carried over into these. So I made a number of different versions of these, and these have actually somewhat similar kind of metallic quality to them, in that there is pearlescence that's mixed into the paint of the background colors. So while they don't shift as radically as the previous paintings do, they do have a slightly metallic kind of feel to them. So because of working with these tree images, I started getting into this idea of graphic space. And I didn't want to only make pictures of trees, so I started thinking about other kinds of images, and I made this is one of the first works on paper when I started thinking about how to make a graphic depiction of water, because I had done these other paintings that people had thought about as being water paintings, but they were much softer, and I wanted something that was much more hard edge. So I made a couple of these works on paper, trying different ways of using more or less the same image to convey an idea of water. And at this point, I was doing this small exhibition in Seattle, and this was another sort of period of punctuation where I decided that what I was going to do, because the space was very small, was just have 3 paintings. Have one of the rock pictures, one tree painting, and then this painting, which was the first large-scale water painting that I did in this more graphic kind of style. And so that show became the template, in a way, for the exhibition that Paula mentioned that I just had in New York last year. And right at this same time, I was given this incredible opportunity to go live in France for 3 months, right across the street from Monet's garden. And so I knew I had this show coming up in New York, and I decided that what I was going to do was just make small paintings that would be studies for that show, and try to work out every single formal issue that I could, and just get it all entirely figured out. Monet's garden, I'm sure some of you have been there. It's a very, very strange place. It's sort of like the Disneyland of art in a certain way. Particularly if you were living there for 3 months, because this is a place that is designed for people to visit for 2 hours. And so when you see the kind of inner workings of this whole system, it's really very strange. A couple of examples. For one, there are no actual Monet paintings in the house that Monet used to live in. There are, however, computer-made facsimiles of Monet's paintings, which you might not know, as I did not for the first month or so, that they were facsimiles. Second of all, nothing is allowed to die in Monet's garden while the garden is open. So they go through, and I'm not kidding with this statistic, 100,000 plants a year that they replant in this place, so that it always looks exactly the way they want it to look. So there was just this really perverse idea of verisimilitude that was in place there, which in a certain way was interesting to me, but in another way I've had a really hard time dealing with. I was also living in this situation where the tourists who were there all day could look in through this gate into the studio where we were working, and it was sort of like being a zoo animal or something. They would hold their hands on the bars and kind of peer in at you, and periodically even try to get into the gate, which was always fun to watch them try to get out. So I wasn't really that interested in engaging with that place in that way. But at Monet's house, he had this incredible collection of 19th century Japanese prints, which I did spend a lot of time with. And this is a picture of a few of them. This is a Hiroshige print. And I had always been interested in Asian art, and felt like it had played into my own work in a way, but I really started to think about, especially because I'd been thinking about these graphic issues, started to think a lot about the way these prints were made, about what relationship they had to my own work. And I'd say, in terms of a kind of art with a capital A experience, this was really what I got out of being in that residency. And I think, in a certain way, it kind of bled into the paintings that I made while I was there, more than the actual garden did. So I just started making these studies. These paintings are all about 20 by 24 inches, and there were quite a few of them. I worked in a much kind of faster way than I had in the past, because I typically make a study before I make a large-scale painting, but I usually make it fairly carefully so that I can use it to make the painting. And with these, I wasn't necessarily thinking like, oh, this will eventually be blown up to, you know, a much larger scale. It was just sort of working through these different ideas, working out these color issues, because I hadn't worked with color. And there's not a lot of color in these paintings. They're still essentially black and white images, but I started, working with different colors than what I had been working with in the past. And let some of the paintings just get really strange, like this one too, giving into this impulse to have the rock pictures be almost sort of otherworldly. And I should say also that the way the slides are set up, it looks like there's this kind of jump where I just start making these more graphic paintings, but the whole time that I was doing that, I continued to make these other kinds of images. And I always sort of feel like as an artist, and particularly as a painter, it's like you're developing this sort of quiver, and you can pull these different arrows from your quiver at different points and when you need them. And so I don't necessarily want to kind of abandon one strategy just to go on to the next. I think it's more interesting if you just kind of keep working with things over time and watch how it evolves, and put things down for a while and come back to it, etc. So I continue to make these rock pictures as well. And some of them got really minimal in this way too, where it was maybe if you didn't know the context of the other paintings, you wouldn't even necessarily know that these were supposed to be branches or something. My father came and visited me while I was in France, and he told me that he thought I should call this painting Suspenders. I decided in homage to him that I would call it Suspension, but not Suspenders. So, all of these led up to the paintings that I made when I got back over the next several months, which resulted in this exhibition, which was in New York last year. And you recognize some of the images do come from the studies that I had made while I was in France, and some of them don't. All of the paintings in this show were fairly big. I'll go through them and talk about them individually. But at this point, I also decided that prior to this, all of my paintings had been untitled, but I decided I wanted to start titling them again. So this was another view. And this gallery where I was showing has this tremendous ceiling that's entirely a skylight, so it was really great for the kind of reflective quality of the paintings because they changed quite a bit. So the individual paintings that I made, this one is the largest painting I've ever made. It's 7.5 by 9 feet. I highly suggest that if you make a painting this big, that you measure the door of your studio before you do that, which I did not do, and had to take it entirely off of the stretcher and have someone re-stretch it for me. It was not very fun. This painting is about 6 feet by 8 feet. This was the title painting from the show. It's called Standstill. This painting is also 6 feet by 8 feet. It's called Pure Phase 2. And whenever anybody gives a slide lecture, they always complain about their slides. I don't feel like I have too many complaints about my slides, except that film does not pick up blue-greens in any way, and these water paintings are actually quite a greenish color that you just can't see because the film won't register it. This painting was called Forecast. This one was called Entire. Actually, the rock paintings I continue to have as untitled pictures. So this one was also untitled. It's about 5 feet by 6 feet. This one's called Lost Leader. And this one's called Airsats. So I think in this show, when I talked about that first exhibition that I did in New York, trying to employ these different pictorial strategies, in this show it was made much, much more explicit. Each of the different kinds of paintings, or the 3 different kinds of paintings, was made using entirely different types of paint. The trees were all acrylic. The water paintings were oil and alkyd paint. And the rock paintings were still using the interference paint and oil paint. And I tried to use different techniques in each of them to try to have these different vocabularies, visual vocabularies going on. So since that time, I have been working with similar kinds of images, and I'll show you some pictures of some of the more recent paintings, trying to play with different compositional devices and different color choices. This painting's called Tension. This one's called Never Rider. And it has a kind of, it's hard to see actually in this slide as well. It's this kind of, well, it's an indistinguishable color. I really like using these in-between colors that actually the true master of the in-between color is Martha Stewart, where you can't quite tell if it's not evident in this slide, but you can't quite tell whether it's yellow or green or blue. This was another rock painting, getting more and more strange in the details. This painting is called One Lick Less. I'm trying to increase the density of the information in the painting. And this one's called Perfect Sleeper. And this is the last painting that I completed that I had a slide of. And was trying to work with the tree pictures in a way that had something a little bit more, or a little bit more of a kind of busyness to them. And I feel like this painting has this almost kind of web-like effect. I'm not entirely sure how successful it is. It might be a little too Halloween for me or something. But I think in a way, it's a direction that I'm going to continue to work with. So that's all the slides I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions before we all go hear our fearless leader speak about our country.
Can you describe how the textural tonalities of the rock paintings are achieved, that through specific values of gray that are directly applied with brush, for instance, or is there some other more non-traditional kind of manipulation of the paint on the surface?
The background for those paintings is made using many, many layers of that industrial paint that I described, built up very thinly over time until it achieves this opacity. The top part of the painting, or the image part of the painting, is made using oil paint in a process where I both apply paint and remove it. So it functions sort of like charcoal drawing or something like that. Anyone else?
At what point in the process of making your paintings do you come up with your titles for your title pieces?
Oh, usually when they're done.
What inspires them?
A lot of them are songs by bands that I like that just sort of fit the mood of the paintings.
what bodies of work are you going to be pursuing with the prints, and what is going to be your strategy for these things that seem pretty specific to paint materials working for them?
Well, I've actually designed the print project because I don't know anything about printmaking whatsoever. I'm going to try to do 3 different images that will each be done in a different print medium. So there would be a tree that's a wood block, a water picture that's a lithograph, and an etching for the rock picture. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Have your ideas about nature changed as a result of doing these paintings?
I don't know if it's as a result of doing the paintings. I would say my ideas, as I think I described, changed in terms of like my interest in this idea of the pop cultural aspect of looking at nature now. I think when I described the Richard Prince picture as being sort of cynical, I think, if anything, I've moved even farther away from that kind of cynicism about it. But there is still a pop cultural element to the paintings in a certain way, and one person who reviewed my show in New York said that they thought that the water pictures looked like something you might see on the side of a surfer's van in the 70s. I sort of like that idea that the pop cultural reference could be much less specific than like this is taken directly from this advertisement, but in a more general kind of way it still has that kind of relevance or something. I don't know if that answers your question. Anyone else?
Is there any problem when you use the advertisements with copyright? How would you get around?
So far, no. Roy Lichtenstein was never sued in his lifetime, so I'm hoping that enough under the radar that nobody's really going to care. And they're actually changed enough that it would be hard for those people to recognize them, I think, too. And Richard Prince, I don't think ever got sued either, so. Okay. Oh, you?
Do you think it's parodic in any way as compared to their source material?
Parodic. No, I don't think so. You mean parodic as in like parody, you mean?
Yeah, like, in a very loose sense.
Yeah, no,
Not to the extent that the Richard Prince stuff is, but, I mean, you are kind of, I mean, I find some humor in the way that you're kind of co-opting it and what you're doing with it. It seems slightly humorous.
yeah, I think it was more that way initially when it was directly appropriated. But I thought about it on one level maybe as being funny, but on another level as being a certain kind of return almost. You know, like I'm taking it back from the advertiser and making it an image that's not about selling anything anymore. So I don't know that it's necessarily, it's not a parody. It's certainly not a parody of the image that the advertiser's using. Whether it's a parody of advertisers, I don't know. I guess so. I mean, if it reads that way, that's okay with me.
Well, I was just thinking that if for instance, Paramount decided to sue you for using that, you could always claim to parody it.
I will hire you as my lawyer. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's the whole suing thing is scaring me now. I'm knocking on wood, but I really doubt that it's going to happen. I think, I mean, one of the things that's great about paintings is that you know, it's one image, so it's in one place, and that's it. And the chances that the CEO of Paramount is going to see it at the place where it now lives is so minimal that, and even if they did see it, I think they would know that its effect is so negligible in a certain way that it's not like I'm printing T-shirts or using it for my own advertisements or something. So. That said, I'm sure that if they thought they could get some money out of me, they would. But. Anyone else?
I have one other question. I've known people who've gone to the Whitney program before, and they always kind of spoke of it as being kind of a very Marxist and very kind of conceptual.
That's right.
Invent, and you seem to have, made this kind of shift away from kind of a more conceptual approach to the paintings to an almost formal understanding of them, and the fact that they're paintings. Like, I'm wondering if that was like if that was a comfortable shift for you, or did you feel any kind of anxiety at all, like coming out of the Whitney program, moving in the direction that you have? Or?
I think I felt a tremendous sense of relief coming out of the Whitney program. I think that in some ways, I don't in any way regret having that very theoretical education, and I think it did inform a lot of the work that I did in school, and it certainly informed the way I was thinking about the paintings I made while I was there and when I was right after I left there. But I think that one thing that happens with institutions is that if it goes well for you, you kind of unlearn what they teach you in a certain way. And that's not to say that you forget about it or you reject it necessarily, but it becomes synthesized into the way that you're thinking. So to me, because I didn't have a formal art education at all, it kind of makes sense that, to me, that I would come around to like the conceptual aspect of it would become synthetic in the work, and then I would come back to this sort of more formal understanding or approach to making the paintings. So to me, it's not as if now they're just formal paintings. It's just I realized I'm not really interested in art that has a very specific kind of prescriptive agenda. And that was one of the things that became clear to me when I was making, for instance, the Paramount painting, and people sort of thought, oh, I get your idea, you know, and that's it, and then I'll move away from it. So that said, it was really weird being a painter at the Whitney program. Everybody was there with their little black and white rub-on letters under their photographs and everything, you know, and they didn't really know. I don't know why they let me in there, but they worked out okay. I made a lot of good friends. So
Do you honestly think that, are you honestly like really confused about, like, did you feel like an early outsider in the program?
not really. No, I mean, I'm trying to be funny, but I mean, I studied semiotics at Brown, you know, so like I could keep up in the conversation. I knew what was going on. I just realized while I was there that, one, they had this idea that painting was just dead, you know, which is just preposterous. But so many people have tried to make that argument, and they felt that the only way to make an effective image politically was for it to be dogmatic and black and white and have text. And I just don't believe in that strategy of art making exclusively. I think there are people who do that, who do it very well, and it's fine. It's just not what I want to do. So I think in some ways being in the Whitney program helped me come to this point where I got a lot of clarity while I was there.
So you're saying that they were thinking in terms of, if you want an artwork to be political, then it has to meet these kind of aesthetic standards. Like, do you find yourself maybe having a different desire for how you want your art to function in the world than maybe they did, how they thought that art should function?
I think I want my art to be much less dogmatic than the people who run the Whitney program would like all art in the world to be. And I actually do think that, I mean, I didn't talk about it at all, but I think there is a sort of environmental component to my work that is very, very subtle. It's not trying to hit anyone over the head, but there's a reason that there aren't very many things that are alive in the pictures, that all the colors are sort of bleak and washed out in this way. But if there is a kind of political thread in artwork, I like it to be about at that level, not like, you know, here is what you need to think, because I think, you know, people get a lot of that as it is. Does that answer your question?
Please join me again in thanking Cameron Martin for a wonderful.
Thank you.